With Amanda Staveley and Murdered Gadusi out of Newcastle and Paul Mitchell in and Eddie Howe seeking assurances, there's plenty of corporate intrigue in Newcastle. But the main question that most Newcastle United fans are asking, what does this mean for our transfers? Let's find out.
Brilliant from Sham. And now Murphy could take on the shot. Fabian Sham.
All right, big up to yourselves, guys. It's Philip here from Toon Tactics TV, and we're looking at the latest transfer news at Newcastle United. And I want to first start off with what kind of I want to look at it at a particular angle, and it's what's encouraged me and was a really productive conversation with Pete Davey from the Loaded Mag. Big up the Loaded Mag. We was talking about Noni Madueke and where the discussion went to is where do we think Newcastle are at and how the right wing position will probably be an indicator of where Newcastle are at in terms of the transfer policy. Obviously, we've had Paul Mitchell in. Amanda and Staveley have gone. There is now Newcastle now in a realignment process, a recalibration process. And I think where Newcastle are at in terms of as a club and is going to bear a lot of impact on what transfers and what kind of players we're looking to bring in. But not only that, it's also going to have a bearing on what players are going to leave. So I wanted to kind of explore that. I wanted to kind of see what that means for our incomings and our outgoings. Despite that, we haven't been short of kind of news in regards to the relationship between Eddie Howe and Paul Mitchell. Obviously, Eddie Howe, with the exit of Amanda and the exit of Murdad, has been seeking reassurances, and there was a particular. And I think that the balance of power, especially in that boardroom, has been with Eddie Howe kind of getting a sway in that in terms of the incomings and the outgoings. So Amanda Murdoch certainly fighting his corner with, I suspect but cannot prove, Jamie Rubin probably most of the times following suit. And then you have obviously Darren Eales, I forgot the lady's name from Perth, that are there kind of probably quite often getting outmaneuvered. And before that was Dan Ashworth, who obviously also left. And so now with Amanda Murdoch gone and Yasser Al-Ramayan now having a lot more of a kind of getting himself a lot more involved in the everyday stuff, especially decisions over transfer news, and the main kind of entry of Paul Mitchell himself, who is no shrinking violet. I can tell you that. He is willing to have the tough conversations. He backs himself, and he has a lot more experience than Dan Ashworth in terms of players, especially in the recruitment of players, and very much experience in actually having an idea of the type of philosophy and how he describes how he wants his teams to play. Eddie Howe obviously has a real strong philosophy as well, how he wants his teams to play as well. So there's going to be that conversation as well. And I'm still going to review my previous videos on that, where they probably would find conflict and how they can find that resolution, because that has an effect on how they will come together when it comes to actual player signings and players leaving. So where would the actual conflicts be? As I mentioned previously, I kind of outlined two places where between Paul Mitchell and Eddie Howe, where those potential conflicts would be. The first one I thought was the preference for young players, especially for players from not just from England, but outside of England, which is, I think, Paul Mitchell's not necessarily his preference, but he's very open to that. He's not scared of that at all. I'm not saying that Eddie Howe is scared or frightened of it, but I think as a manager who's obviously will be looking for job security, having players who have played in the Premier League, played in England, there's a certain certainty that they will play well, even though they might not be necessarily the ceiling raisers that they could potentially be. So I think obviously Paul Mitchell's preference for young players, foreign players, and Eddie Howe's preference for experienced players or Premier League players, there is a potential clash in between that when they're going for players. So obviously, we've talked about the right wing position. We know if we're saying, if we were to say Gerard Bowen and we was to say, let me think of a right winger from abroad. Nicolas Gonzalez has recently come up. Not necessarily, you can probably kind of deduce from that it's probably that Gerard Bowen is a very much an Eddie Howe signing, whereas Nicolas Gonzalez or a player of that ilk profile, who's probably even younger, actually, if I was to think of. I think Matthias Tell recently came up from Bayern Munich. Those type of players, then you're probably going to say that's more of a Paul Mitchell style sign. So there could be a potential clash in that. So what could be the common ground? Well, they could get younger players from the same Premier League. They could get young players from the Premier League with that kind of so that the balance between potential and readiness. So there's that balance. So hence why when Noni Madueke came up, and I know that in some quarters those rumors have been dismissed. But the very founder of Footy Insider, I know Footy Insider, people will probably relegate them to a tier 3, tier 4 source of journalism. But it's not the first time Noni Madueke's name has come up. His name has come up in the Telegraph before. Also, so it's not kind of uncommon. It's just that how far Footy Insider claimed the process has gone, which is it's in advanced stages in terms of personal agreement, and all that needs to be signed is agreed is the fee. So I think that's where people are like, oh, this is rubbish. But Noni Madueke, for instance, the profile, he's young, he's played abroad, but he's also now had a year, just over a year's actually experience in the Premier League. And so that's where I think you'd have a common ground between Paul Mitchell and Eddie Howe. It doesn't have to be Noni Madueke. If people don't like Noni Madueke, that's cool. I think there's bags of potential there, and I think he'll fit our profile. He's about 6 foot something, athletic, tall, and in terms of his output, he's played 1,000 minutes in the Premier League last year, 23 games, only 11 starts. He's constantly subbed on or subbed off, and in between that time, he's still made an 11-goal contribution. So I think that's pretty good, and I can only imagine what that could happen if under Eddie Howe's tutelage, playing full 90-minute games. I can only see that increase. I can only see his output getting better, as was the case with Anthony Gordon, who the highest goals contributions total he had before he joined Newcastle at Everton was 6 goals. So I think Noni Madueke that could be something that could happen to Noni Madueke. It doesn't have to be Noni Madueke. We've had rumors, obviously, of Oscar Bob, who we'll talk about a little bit later. Again, comes from foreign leagues, but has been playing with Man City for a good time now. And again, young, really high ceiling, and you can see that there's also in terms of the philosophy between Paul Mitchell and the philosophy between Eddie Howe, i.e. experience versus a preference for young foreign talent. You can see a merger there. So I think there's some common ground. It's going to take some calibration, but there's some common ground there. The second issue, or the second point of conflict that could arise from Paul Mitchell and Eddie Howe, I know there's others as well. I'm not going to use the program to talk about Mr. Bunce and the performance analyst part of it. That might be another show for another time. But we're talking about player turnover. And I know that Monaco is a whole different case, but 77 players were reduced by more than half. And it's also, Paul Mitchell comes from the point of view of Southampton, Tottenham. He's not afraid to have a high turnover of players for financial reasons for the club, but also to make sure that competition and everything remains high. Eddie Howe, though, and I think Paul Mitchell sees it as a natural as a natural way to as a natural consequence of developing young players and keeping profit for the club as well. Eddie Howe, though, obviously we know he has a real preference for stability. I don't know how many times Paul Dummett's contract has been renewed, how many times Dubravka's contract has been renewed, how many times Gillespie's contract has been renewed, Matt Ritchie's, thank goodness, only gone now. Those guys, those year contracts have been renewed. Eddie Howe, as most managers want, are always fighting for consistency, and especially when they're trying to keep the team harmony in the dressing room consistent and stable. And so you got the Paul Mitchell's high turnover, competition, but also meeting the financial priorities of the club, clashing with Eddie Howe's a need for stability, need to keep things going, need for a certainty for himself and for his players, and ensuring that that's there. So how can they get into a kind of a common ground over that? Well, they can have a more gradual turnover, so not as high. So Mitchell could phase in young players in and out with experienced figures. So it's allowing more of a smoother transition. And to be fair, I know Paul Mitchell wasn't there when this began to happen, but I suspect he was playing in the backgrounds before it had been officially announced. We've had about, and I'm going to show this later, a number of players, several players already have been allowed for their, including Matt Ritchie and others, for their contracts to be run over and for them to leave. Obviously, Ryan Fraser's, we're trying to get him out of the club as well, all those type of players. So you're beginning to see that, and we still need more of that. And you'll see the big problem that Newcastle have. There also needs to be a clear expectation, and we're talking about communication part of that. And obviously, the fact that Eddie Howe was live on Newcastle News on TV, essentially saying, "Hey, I need some assurances," lets you know that it wasn't the communication that they need. So there needs to be clear expectations around. So they need to accept. They need to have and I think this is what the meetings have been. What is acceptable turnover, and how can they prioritize keeping certain experienced players? And it'd be interesting to see. With obviously news around Kieran Trippier, is he staying? Is he going? Callum Wilson, is he staying? Is he going? Sean Longstaff beginning to appear, and obviously, and all those type of figures, are they staying? Are they going? You know, it's going to be really, really interesting where they find common ground with that. I think so. They need to have a kind of a clear expectation between themselves, Paul Mitchell and Eddie Howe, of what that kind of the rate of turnover is going to be, and also the focus of retention. So Mitchell could prioritize finding young players with potential to stay long term, aligning with Howe's preference. So if for instance we've got Oscar Bobbin, who's 21, 22, incredible talent, you can see him, should he obviously continue to improve and all those other things and be happy to stay at Newcastle, you can see him staying at Newcastle for the next 5 to 8 years. And that suits Eddie Howe, his need for long-term consistency and stability. And it suits Paul Mitchell of having high quality, high ceiling, young players coming in and staying, but also possibly having a high resale value attached to that. So there is a real kind of opportunities there for the both of them. So that's where the potential clashes are and the potential resolutions. Now, the big factor for me, before we even talk about incomings and on potential players and stuff like that, is the number of players that we have that are left on they've only got 1 year left on their contract, so they're ready to leave by next June 2025. I think we've got Sean Longstaff, Callum Wilson, Kieran Trippier, Fabian Shaw, Dan Burn, Jamal Lascelles, Jamal Lewis had a great game, a decent game yesterday when I watched him. Ryan Fraser, Emil Kraft, and Martin Dubravka. I've got 9 on my fingers. I feel like there's more. I'm not going to count it again for sake of time. I think it's about 9 players. 9 players we have here on 1 year left. Now you can already count Ryan Fraser. We are trying to get him out. There's negotiations around that. Martin Dubravka, we are actively trying to get him out, although he's on Japan. He's on the way to Japan, guys. So we are also trying to get him back, get him out. Jamal Lewis have been trying to sell him for ages, but it's proven to be near impossible. So he might be staying for this, unless this is where Paul Mitchell is going to have to earn his money. Again, so that's 3 players that I know we're actively trying to get out. We can't get Jamal Lascelles out because he's injured with an ACL and is unlikely to leave for this year. So that's, there's already an issue there. That's probably going to end up being a loss unless we renew his contract. It's another thing that I think Paul Mitchell doesn't want to have. The other one was I think Emil Kraft will stay for the rest of the year. But I really think had Paul Mitchell come in earlier, I don't think we're going to see Emil Kraft, even though he had a solid game yesterday. That leaves us with the actual assets that we have. The assets mean the guys that will make us the money. And this is just reading financial side of things, looking at over our contracts, our previous, transfers in terms of sellable assets and how much do we need to sell. You'd have seen from my previous videos that I think if Newcastle were to spend 150 million on players coming in, we need to be able to sell between 30 to 50 million in order to make that happen. Now, some people would say we've already sold about 60 to 70 million, but that was for the previous financial cycle. There's a new cycle coming on. And I think the key thing for Paul Mitchell is we do not want a repeat of what's just happened with panic selling. We were 70 million pounds in the hole, and we're panic selling with 24 hours to go, and with the possibility of having to sell Anthony Gordon to Liverpool. Paul Mitchell is gonna avoid it at all costs, even if it means getting Eddie's backup. So if we're looking at Sean Longstaff, we're looking at Callum Wilson, Kieran Trippier. I think in terms of the players that have been most talked about. And between them, I think obviously this is transfer window. This is transfer.com. These are in euros. Combined between them is about 48 million. But also Miggy Almiron. I think he's got more than a year left on his contract. But if we kind of add Miggy Almiron to that, we've got about 60, about maybe 60 million pounds, 60 to 65 million pounds worth of players that we could sell. But in terms of the players that are left on the 1-year contracts, we're about 45 million there. Okay, Callum Wilson's already told a fan or something like that he's going to stay. He's injured. Are we even going to be able to sell him? He might not have been fit for the first game of the week. Apparently, there's news saying, Eddie Howe's begging Kieran Trippier to stay. So that leaves us with Sean Longstaff. Sean Longstaff wasn't at the Hull game, but he's on the list to Japan. So my main thing is, where are we going to make up that 30 to 50 million pounds in sales in order to buy the players that we want? And I think that's where the key conversations between Paul Mitchell and Eddie Howe are going to happen. This is what we talked about earlier in terms of when they sit down and say, okay, this is the expected turnover. This is the players that we're going to have to sell if we're going to be able to buy such and such a player that we want. And if you want an extra player, this is or a particular, or if you're willing to die on your hill on this particular player and they cost this much, we're gonna have to sell even more. So there's real kind of conversations that Paul Mitchell and Eddie Howe are gonna have, and so that's why I feel like it's more than them just kind of zeroing in on targets. I think yes, they have targets, but I think Paul Mitchell coming in there's a real recalibration, real realignment going on in terms of who Newcastle target and kind of their approach to the market itself. That it's going to be beyond just the Premier League or players that have played in England. It's going to be looking into the foreign fields themselves, and the age being a lot younger. I think we'll be trying to reduce the age of our players for ages now, and I think you're going to see that happening now. So I'm really, really interested to see who Newcastle sell, how much we sell, and who we bring in. I think it's going to have a real influence. And I think I think it will also have an influence on whether Eddie Howe stays, even though I do think he stays for this year. What's his going to be approach for next year? If I was Eddie Howe, if I want to go from good to great, I think this is what I need to adapt to. I think Paul Mitchell's got at least 2 or 3 main missions. One is to make Newcastle economically sustainable. 2 is to make Newcastle competitive on the pitch year in and year out, and 3 for Newcastle as a team to raise the floor as well as raise the ceiling as a club in itself, and that kind of surrounding all the other stuff, the academy, the women's football and everything else. And so he's going to do it with hell or high water, and Eddie Howe's going to have to get with that program. At the same time also, and this is moving on to the next phase of things. I think I can't remember, and folks, do tell me in the chat. Do tell me in the comments. Send in your comments, like and subscribe as always. But I don't think Paul Mitchell's won anything anywhere. Either has Eddie Howe. Has obviously got promotions. So I think partly what the reason for that is, yes, Paul Mitchell has got in great players. He's made clubs financially sustainable and competitive. But I think maybe part of the reason why he hasn't won anything, it's not his fault. He's not managing the players, he's not the players themselves. But maybe whatever that significant thing is might come down to that his philosophy isn't bulletproof, or maybe he hasn't, that maybe having too much of a higher turnover, or maybe relying a little bit too much on foreign players has built into inconsistency, and maybe there'll be a few players that have been flops that have kept him from winning trophies. And Eddie Howe provides that consistency, and he provides that certainty with his preference for experienced Premier League players. However, Eddie Howe himself hasn't won any domestic or major trophies himself. And part of that reason is his reluctance to get in foreign players and talented players from away from the Premier League, and also not being decisive enough, not being willing enough to open himself up to a little bit more higher turnovers in terms of players, to increase the competition within his squad, but also to be able to help the club to financially build itself. So I think they need each other. I really do. So going on to the kind of obviously where our transfers are currently is mainly obviously we've secured Lewis Hall on a permanent contract that's come out of this year's was it this year's? Oh, well, I don't know which cycle. I think it was last cycle's. And so 33 million pounds or 33 million euros. He was fantastic against Hull. I really, really got to enjoy watching him live, by the way. Odysseus had a decent game. And we didn't buy him for, less than 10 million, guys. I think we're looking at, so they've got it on 23 euros here. It's about 20 million pounds as well. So we've spent already 53 million, 56 million on arrivals here. Obviously, free transfer for Lloyd Kelly, Alex Murphy, John Ruddy. So we've already spent 56 million pounds. At the same time, we've also let go of about 76 million pounds in euros of talent, and that's Elliot Anderson and Yakumba Minte. That's talent that we did not want to let go. However, and this would be my criticism, and I know it's hindsight's 2020, but my criticism for, if the stories are to be believed to be true, around Amanda Murdad and Eddie Howe, had we sold Callum Wilson, Kieran Trippier, some of the older players last year, and been more willing to have that kind of to say, okay, we may need that turnover to be economically viable and competitive, and avoid the selling of our prized assets, our young assets like Elliot Anderson and Yakumba Minte, and unsettling an Anthony Gordon by saying, hey, we might have to sell you. Had we sold those guys, we wouldn't have been in that position. And that's where Paul Mitchell becomes so important and effective for us. But let me know what you guys think into that. Do you think I'm a bit too harsh on that? Do you think there's more to the story? Let me know what you guys think. But that's just my perspective and how I see it. And obviously, Loris Karius, Matt Ritchie, and Paul Dummett, I've had their contracts run down. So there's more to go with that. And I think there's more departures and more kind of obviously hopefully arrivals to that. So that's where Newcastle currently stand. It's mixed for me at the moment. I think at the end of it, I'm going to rate the transfer window at the end of when does it end? September, or end of August, or September. I am going to rate it. At the moment, I'm feeling it's quite mixed. So it'll be really interesting to see what players come in. But let me know what you guys think. How do you rate the transfer window so far? And in terms of the latest kind of information on players coming in, players that have been fancied, and where does this align with the current philosophy at the club? Obviously, I know people are going to mention Brian Mbuemo. We're going to mention all the other players we've mentioned in previous videos, Pedro Neto and all those guys. I wanted to look for something new. There hasn't been any more news on Neto. I think whenever I hear Tottenham talking about it, Arsenal talking about it, they think he's coming to them. Brian Mbuemo, he was linked to Liverpool at some point. All those things kind of have gone silent. A lot of conversations around Ivan Toney at Brentford as well. So I'm not sure. I am going to talk about the players, some of the players that come up this week. Really interesting players. I forgot to include Oscar Bob in that, frustratingly, annoyingly. But obviously, Malik Chow, who obviously, again, I've heard a lot more kind of detailed information about him on the Loaded Mag. Big up the Loaded Mag. And the guest that came on, I'm really sorry I forgot his name. He's a really good, really good football analyst as well. He kind of gave his breakdown, which aligns with what I've heard from what I've read on scouting reports, and also what I've actually heard from actual football analysts as well about Malik Chow, where he's essentially a destroyer, very proactive in terms of going into the tackle. Some concerns about him getting turned by players, can lose his concentration a little bit. He's, according to the Italian journalist, he felt he's better playing in a team that kind of counter-attacks rather than the team that presses. But we'll see about that. So he's a really, really, really raw talent. He had one really, really good year at AC Milan, and then had one really poor year. But and that year, a lot of AC Milan players were poor. So we're probably going to get him for 30 euro millions if we can get him. I guess all we're waiting for is AC Milan to finalize their kind of replacement for Malik Chow himself. So really, really interesting Malik Chow. Nicolas Gonzalez has come up on our radars as well. I don't know who he was, obviously, until obviously he was mentioned. I did a little bit of kind of research on him on the scout reports as well. Just looked at a few YouTube hits, but also listened to the Italian journalist as well, who gave his view on him. Thought that he's a right winger, right wing forward with style and substance, and he is not only good on the ball, but off the ball as well. Really good in the 1v1s. His goal contributions have also, and goal creativity has increased as well in the last year, which is positive. Part of the reasons why, again, to Italian journalists, why he hasn't been picked up by the bigger clubs is that he hasn't really shown up in the big occasions, big time games, especially in the European Cup competition. So let's see where that kind of, when we go with that. When I look at him, though, and I know I haven't been extensive on him, I haven't seen the live game of him, I'm a little bit unconvinced. And I think we can do, he's an upgrade on Almiron. He is an upgrade on Almiron, but I think we can do a little bit better. I personally prefer, and people might not like this, I prefer Noni Madueke over him. I like the fact that Noni Madueke has played in the Premier League and has done well. Is about 6 foot something. Looks a little bit more athletic for me as well. And I think he has a higher ceiling, whereas Gonzalez is already 26 years old. So that's my view on that. Oscar Bob came up, and obviously it was also Scott McAtee as well, but I'm going to talk a little bit more Oscar Bob in terms of how more of an exchange deal or a loan to Black White. Well, there's two deals, and it's surrounding Bruno Gomes. So, and this comes from City Central as well, where they say, or City Extra, excuse me, where there's a talk about them wanting Bruno Gomes for 60 million and throwing in Oscar Bob with that. You guys let me know. Do you think it's a good deal? I think there's also a deal where they want to throw in Oscar Bob and Scott McAtee into that. Scott McAtee's play, it looks like he plays more in the central midfield as well. And I know that we've seen Oscar Bob playing on the right wing forward position. Really skillful, talented player. I think he's better in the possession-based team. He hasn't really got the explosive pace, but what he does lack in kind of explosive pace, I think he has in technical ability. But he's also having to learn when to let go of the ball and make certain passes. But he has so many good attributes in terms of his ability to hold onto the ball, striking, good upper body strength, all those type of things. I think he's a really exciting signing. I wouldn't trade him for Bruno Gomes, even for £60 million. And I don't think Eddie Howe would. And I don't think, because we still have to get replace a midfielder in there. in terms of João, maybe a João Gomez type of thing. And it's a lot more work for Newcastle to do and to be able to build up that midfield chemistry again, which they don't have time to do with the Premier League starting in the next 3 weeks. I think if Man City were to loan him to us with a loan to buy or just outright sell him, I think that would be the better deal. I think Oscar, and again, Oscar Bob, if we're talking about transfer philosophy and our approach, that's where I think Eddie Howe and Paul Mitchell will probably meet in the middle and say, yeah, we'll take this guy on. So your Oscar Bobs, your Noni Maduekes, those type of guys as well. So let me know what you guys think about those. Noni Madueke, Malik Chow, Nicolas Gonzalez, Oscar Bob. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. And who do you guys think we should go for? If we were able to follow those conditions between Eddie Howe and Paul Mitchell, having young players, maybe from the Premier League, from England as well, but also for looking for further afield as well. What do you guys think about the players that we can bring in, the players that we could sell? Who do we sell? Who do you think we're going to see coming in the next week? Let me know what you guys think. I think there's a lot to unpack. I think in terms of the players that are going to come in, I am not worried just yet. I do think, though, that I think the week coming up, players need to let go of, whether it's Sean Longstaff, Almiron, Kieran Trippier. We need to sell them this week, and we need to bring players in, because then otherwise that will just leave us with 2 weeks, 1 week, and no real business of significance happening. I think we need to. I know I've been saying this weeks and weeks and weeks on end, but we've now got 3 weeks to go before our first game of the season, and we need to move on. And I think how Paul Mitchell and Eddie Howe probably seeing it is better to be patient and get things right rather than rush and get things wrong. And it's been a mixed transfer window so far, and they want to get things right. So fair enough to them. But let me know what you guys think. As always a blessing to be able to talk to you. I want to hear your opinions. I want to hear your views. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe, guys. And until next time, guys, take care and God bless, folks.
Brilliant from Sham. And now Murphy can take on the shot. Fabian Sham.